So I've discussed that it would be unwise for China to invade Taiwan from a military perspective, and in those analyses, I've somewhat discussed the effects on the economy and how it would also negatively impact China. But I've never actually made a video totally discussing economically why it would be completely stupid for China to invade Taiwan, and this is even if the US isn't involved. The dramatic impacts on the Chinese economy would be significant. Areas such as imports, exports, domestic financial markets, currency exchange rates, stuff that they need to maintain favorable pricing in their trade, as well as just general business investments, would all see massive downtrends in China. China's top 4 trading partner countries are the United States, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. All would be belligerent to China in this event. The collective European Union makes up an enormous portion of China's trade and would also likely implement its own set of sanctions. And again, this is a scenario if the United States doesn't militarily get involved. China's costs would significantly increase if the U.S. military intervenes in any meaningful ways, even if that intervention comes a bit late. The reality for China is that 90% of its oil is shipped through the area where the conflict would be directly taking place. Much of that oil originates in locations that would be easy for the more powerful and expeditionary U.S. Navy to conduct blockading efforts at points of origin, places in the Persian Gulf or even the Western Hemisphere. Food is also an issue for China, as China only produces about 60 to 65% of the domestic demand for food in China. And this is due to safety concerns, because we've seen, especially in baby food areas, children have been killed by lackluster Chinese food production safety. 300,000 children were poisoned by baby food in 2008. In addition, food is not actually cheaper to produce in China in some cases. Things like soybeans, it's actually cheaper to produce in the U.S. and ship to China than to produce domestically. The Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs in the People's Republic of China has said that soybeans are 1.3 times more expensive to produce in China than in the United States, and they yield a 60% less crop. On top of that, China's arable land continues to drop because it's lost 5 to 7% due to factors such as over-fertilization and general neglect. So leading up to the conflict, these are areas that could be targeted. The United States would warn the world of China's military intentions, hoping to rally its allies and deter any kind of attack in this area where the U.S. has made, and this is an area where the U.S. has made significant credibility gains because of previous predictions they made with regard to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Beijing would likely counter many of the U.S. efforts by claiming Taiwan provoked them, some sort of red line was crossed, or there was a false flag attack, essentially following the Russian playbook in this arena. Staunch allies of the U.S., which include Australia, Japan, the United Kingdom, would coordinate steps for China's to deter the invasion, to try and stop it before it actually happened. But other countries in the U.S. alliance sphere of influence may take a more step back and wait and see approach, and saying that Beijing may be merely saber rattling. So it'll be kind of a mixed bag. Financial markets would be the first to respond, though, with strong downward pressure on Chinese assets, especially the yuan exchange rate. Because direct investors have more skin in the game when they directly invest in businesses, they also may take a wait and see approach because they don't want to lose the assets they've invested, but they also may potentially see that a wartime Chinese economy is still a profitable venture. A conflict over Taiwan would devastate the global economy, though. It would be pretty bad for a few nations, but would be particularly terrible for China. Commercial shipping through the war zone and nearby ports would collapse, causing financial markets to panic, as well as seizing up supply chains. You remember all the supply chain issues we had in COVID? Think of that, but probably a little worse. China would likely impose emergency economic measures, such as strong capital controls, seizing assets abroad, or not seizing, selling Chinese assets abroad, stockpiling emergency supplies, suspending exports of critical materials that they need for their wartime effort, as well as rationing imported goods that they know they won't get any more of. Additionally, they may restrict travel both in and out. Further efforts may be taken to secure its economy, all based on probably the Russian playbook of how they did this. Things are different, though, for them because China is so externally facing. Russia can rely on its commodities and energy to prop its economy in the sanction regime, whereas China cannot. China would have to take pretty rapid measures to protect its military assets, as well as Taiwan and the United States could severely damage both financially the ability to fund these military assets as well as just directly damage them physically along areas in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. 6 of China's largest ports are near Taiwan and would definitely be impacted by any kind of efforts of Taiwan responding to a Chinese attack. And again, as I've said, 90% of Chinese imported oil comes through this area, as well as 30% of Chinese imported food. Because of this, the global economy would likely see a reduction of about $2.5 trillion, which is pretty significant in the grand scheme of things, but wouldn't be absolutely like a death knell here. Corporations would face the most pressure to decouple from China and unwind their operations, and they'd have to do this before China would implement heavy controls on capital, worker, or production flight. Chinese citizens and companies, as well as investors and foreign firms, would seek to get out of China before getting caught up in these capital controls in the Western sanctions. Any person who owns stock in Chinese companies would also likely dump them because they would be afraid of the risk involved. And often, as we've seen time and time again, when you have risky ventures taking place, such as wars, the capital flight moves to the United States through U.S. Treasury, securities, and U.S. markets. And this is consistent time and time again throughout history. China would be at a disadvantage, as Western nations have had practice now in implementing sanctions regimes or a coalition of sanctions regime because of Russia. They have tons of lessons learned and the coordination mechanisms already in place that they could essentially pivot to China. And the European Union has far greater financial and economic ties to the United States than China. And Europe actually aligns more politically, culturally, and relies more on the U.S. for its security apparatus than they do China. So the U.S. would likely present leaders with a choice: join the sanctions effort or potentially face your own set of consequences from the leading economies in the world, including the United Kingdom and Japan. And because much of Europe relies on the United States for its security needs, those requests may become ultimatums over time. Even if China was successful in taking Taiwan, Taiwan's economy would be shattered and cut off from most of the trade, losing the ability to export the majority of the world's semiconductors and microchips, which impacts China heavily because they're a major assembler of electronics. Within Taiwan, China would be facing an aggressive and angry population that they would have to occupy by force rather than be seen as liberators, something China doesn't have the long-term capacity to do. China would face not only the insurgency, but the semiconductor industry would likely be isolated from the rest of the world. And this assumes companies such as Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, or TSMC, isn't just flat out destroyed or sabotaged during the fighting. Even if Beijing got the equipment that TSMC operates, it's relies on foreign inputs. Places like Japan, the United States, and the Netherlands provide TSMC with the chip designs for chip manufacturing and the equipment, all of which would be controlled. Most electronics and computer manufacturers would see Taiwan as not a reliable exporter anymore, meaning that even though China may gain specific window for having a tech advancement, that's only very small, as the ever-marching movement of this tech would pass them once again because no one would trade with them the new ideas in tech. Much like Russia, China may even see negative effects from its neighbors, as Chinese aggression would likely galvanize its surge in military spending in places like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and India as well, potentially even Vietnam and the Philippines, all of which would look to Western weapons manufacturers for their security guarantees and needs. The reality is the G7, which is a rough estimate for the U.S. alliance in this situation, would counter China, and they have a GDP that is 65% larger than China's by purchasing power parity, and the G7 absorbs 41% of China's exports. So even if successful, there was very little benefit for China's invasion. In fact, there's no benefit. It's just a bad situation for them if China invaded Taiwan. So short of the whims of Xi Jinping and his stomach for becoming the next iteration of Putin, China invading Taiwan just doesn't make economic sense whatsoever.